Disturbing stories of cemetery guards. The full moon hung like a sickle above the cemetery, casting long, twisted shadows over the gravestones. Jack had heard stories of what happens when the sun goes down, but nothing had prepared him for what he found when he took the night shift alone. The whispers, they weren't just in his head. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more terrifying stories. What if the dead aren't as dead as we think they are? Jack had only been working at Evergreen Cemetery for 3 months, but it felt like years. The cemetery wasn't huge, nestled quietly at the edge of the town of Harlow, where the mist seemed to hover over the land even in broad daylight. It was a cemetery full of forgotten souls, their names faded on old, cracked tombstones. Yet, despite the town's history, it was a peaceful place during the day. The rows of gravestones were neatly aligned like soldiers at attention, their eternal watch over the quiet dead, disturbed only by the occasional flutter of wind or the sound of birds calling overhead. But at night, that was something different. At night, the air felt wrong. Jack could never quite explain it, but something about the quiet, moonlit hours twisted the very atmosphere, making him feel like he was intruding on a space that wasn't meant for the living. Tonight, however, felt worse than usual. The thick, humid air weighed on him as he sat inside the small guard booth by the entrance. The sounds of the world outside had been swallowed up by the immense blackness of the cemetery. The tiny lights from the booth cast weak beams across the endless rows of gravestones, but even they seemed to struggle against the overpowering darkness, as if the night itself was slowly creeping in, ready to consume everything. Jack tried to shake off the unease, telling himself it was just another long night of guarding the dead. He'd been doing it for 3 months after all. But tonight, his nerves were on edge, and every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, seemed to echo too loudly in his ears. It felt as if the silence was stretching out of control, like a taut wire ready to snap. The shadows outside were unsettling. They didn't behave like shadows should. Most people wouldn't notice the subtle, eerie movement, how they seemed to shift and crawl, as if alive, like they were responding to something unseen. But Jack saw them, and every time he glanced out of the booth, he could swear the darkness was just a little more distorted. The trees in the cemetery swayed slightly, but the shadows clung to the ground with an unnatural stillness, stretching out and curling around the gravestones. The dead had been buried here for generations, but tonight, Jack felt like he was the one trapped in their graveyard. The weight of their hollow gaze seemed to pierce through the dark. His flashlight flickered. The small, weak light sputtered like a dying heartbeat, casting uneven beams across the rows of tombstones, casting eerie, monstrous shadows that twisted and twitched in the corners of his vision. The usual hum of the world seemed to fade away in the glow of the flashlight, and suddenly, he felt very alone. The buzzing of his own heartbeat filled his ears, drowning out the soft wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt as though the cemetery itself was holding its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. For a brief moment, Jack entertained the thought of getting up and walking through the cemetery, checking the gates, the paths, just to prove there was nothing wrong. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, he dismissed it. The last guard who'd worked here had vanished without a trace, a fact that was whispered among the locals like a curse. Jack wasn't stupid. He knew better than to wander out there alone at night. Still, the overwhelming feeling of being watched gnawed at him, as if the eyes of the dead were tracking his every move. He leaned forward in his chair, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at his stomach. It was probably just the isolation playing tricks on his mind. The wind outside had picked up, and the low whistle of air through the trees only made the silence feel even more profound. The only company he had now was the old clock in the booth, its tick-tock sounding louder than usual, almost deafening in the quiet of the night. Jack ran his hands through his hair, brushing the sweat off his brow. His breath was shallow, and he was certain that, in the distance, there was movement. But no, he had to be imagining it. There was nothing. The cemetery was empty. Just as he stood up to reassure himself, to step outside and feel the cool night air against his skin, The flickering of the flashlight stopped. The beam of light steadied, cutting through the dark, casting sharp angles over the gravestones and monuments. But something was off. It wasn't just the shadows anymore. The air felt thick. His chest tightened. The stillness had become oppressive. He looked out the booth window again, his eyes scanning the distance, looking for the source of the strange unease creeping into his bones. There, a figure, standing perfectly still at the far end of the cemetery, just between the two oldest mausoleums. It couldn't be a person. The cemetery had been locked up tight, but there it was, standing there, unmoving. Jack's heart pounded, and his breath caught in his throat. The figure was barely visible in the pale moonlight, but its silhouette was unmistakable. Tall, thin, with long arms that hung limply at its sides. There was no head, only a shadow, a dark void where a face should have been. Jack blinked, certain that his eyes were playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, it was still there, unmoving, as though it had always been. And then, it moved. Slowly at first, its limbs jerking in unnatural ways, as if it wasn't used to walking. The movement was wrong, mechanical, like a puppet controlled by strings, each step dragging through the dirt with a horrible, wet sound. Jack's stomach twisted into knots as the figure came closer, its shape distorting with every movement. The silence felt suffocating, like the very earth was pressing down on him, crushing him with an unseen weight. His heart was racing. His hands were clammy as he clutched the flashlight tighter, the cold steel biting into his skin. It stopped. The figure was only a few feet away now, close enough that Jack could see the ground beneath it, but it didn't make a sound. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. Just the faintest rustling in the trees. His eyes locked onto the spot where the figure should have been, but when he blinked, when his eyes shifted even slightly, the figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished into the shadows. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps. His body was shaking, his mind scrambling to make sense of what he had just seen. But there was no logic to this, no reason for it. The figure hadn't been human. No person could have moved like that, twisted and unnatural. He wasn't alone. Jack took a step back from the booth window, his pulse pounding in his ears. The cemetery was silent again, but the silence felt like a trap. Something was coming for him, something that had been watching from the moment he stepped inside. The question wasn't if it would find him. The question was, how long would he survive before it did? The first whisper came softly, like a breath against his ear. At first, Jack thought it was the wind. Maybe a shift in the air, a shift in the trees, bending under the weight of their age and the wear of the seasons. But when the whisper came again, clearer, more urgent, he felt a sudden chill creep up his spine. His skin prickled as if invisible fingers were running up the back of his neck. His eyes shot to the window of the booth, scanning the cemetery again, though he knew deep down that he would not see anything. The cemetery was vast, stretching beyond the fence like a living, breathing entity. And yet, it felt too confined, too small for the weight of what was creeping inside. It was impossible to ignore the sensation that there was something in there with high. At first, it was easy to dismiss the whispers, but as the minutes ticked by, as the air grew thicker with every passing second, the sound became more distinct, more coherent. "Help me." The voice was a low rasp, barely a whisper, but unmistakable in its desperation. Jack's stomach dropped. It wasn't just the wind, it wasn't a trick of his tired mind. He could hear it. Right behind him, the words laced with a sense of urgency, pleading for something, begging for release. His pulse quickened, and his breath caught in his throat. There was something unnatural about it, something deeply wrong. Every cell in his body screamed at him to turn around, to look over his shoulder, but he couldn't. It was as if the whispering voice had wrapped itself around his spine, binding him to the booth, forcing him to listen, to stay. His eyes flickered nervously to the guard booth's window, and once again, he found nothing. The cemetery lay before him in all its dark splendor, its tombstones silently watching over the dead, its trees swaying gently in the breeze. Yet nothing about this scene felt ordinary. Every rustling leaf, every soft sound carried weight, like each movement in the cemetery was deliberate, calculated. Even the moonlight seemed out of place tonight, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched too far across the ground. A soft breeze fluttered against his face, and for a moment he thought he saw something. A shape, a silhouette in the far distance, near the old mausoleum. But when he blinked, it was gone, just like the whispers. Then came the second whisper, and it was louder, clearer. "Help me. Please." The voice was no longer a mere suggestion, it was insistent, pleading, as if it were right beside him. He stiffened, his body going rigid as the cold air pressed against his skin. The sound seemed to crawl under his flesh, sinking into his bones, twisting them with fear. He turned in his seat, his eyes darting nervously around the booth. He knew what he had to do, but his feet refused to move. He had to get up. He had to step outside. The cemetery couldn't be empty, could it? There had to be someone out there, a trickster, someone who had somehow managed to sneak in. But no matter how much he told himself this, his gut told him otherwise. There was nothing out there. Nothing human, at least. His hands trembled as he clutched the flashlight, the beam of light trembling in his hand, casting shadows that seemed to slither along the edges of the booth, lurking just beyond his reach. He was being watched. He could feel it. The whispers grew louder still, now so clear that they felt like they were echoing directly inside his skull, an internal cacophony that no longer seemed to come from the outside world. The voice, or perhaps the collection of voices, was no longer pleading for help. It was calling to him now. Come closer. Come closer. The voice was no longer sweet, no longer a mere request. It was a command, insistent and vile, pulling at something deep inside him, something he couldn't control. His mouth went dry as the words reached into his very soul, a thread of terror creeping down his spine. He gripped the flashlight tighter, trying to force himself to stand, to take one step outside, one step away from the safety of the booth. But the whispers had a power he hadn't anticipated. They twisted the air around him, suffocating him, pulling him toward the door, pushing him toward the cemetery that seemed to be alive with malice. His body, despite his efforts to control it, betrayed him. He felt paralyzed, caught between his will to flee and the terrible compulsion to obey the whispers. With a strained breath, he staggered to his feet, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The cold night air hit him like a slap to the face, biting at his skin and making him shiver uncontrollably. The cemetery stretched out before him, the gravestones bathed in the sickly glow of the moonlight. The mausoleum stood at the far end of the cemetery like a silent sentinel, its heavy stone door slightly ajar. It looked as though it had always been like that, as if it had been waiting for something. Jack tried to focus, tried to ignore the overwhelming presence that seemed to press in on him from every side. But it was impossible. The shadows were moving again. They weren't just stretching or twisting, they were alive. He could see them crawling, slithering between the gravestones, twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. It was as if the very earth itself was shifting beneath him. As he moved forward, drawn by the whispers, Jack found himself standing at the edge of the graveyard. The iron gate stood before him, locked, but the feeling of being trapped was suffocating. The cemetery felt like a living entity, its every stone and tree a part of something much larger, something malevolent. The air grew colder still. Every rustle of leaves felt like a hiss, a warning. The moon above was too bright, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to follow his every movement, as if the darkness itself were stalking him. A low, guttural growl echoed through the cemetery, the sound coming from somewhere deep within the mausoleum. It was not an animal's growl, not the bark of a dog or the hiss of some unseen creature in the shadows. This growl was something else, something ancient and unnatural, something that had not been heard for a very long time. Jack froze. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The growl wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. The shadows seemed to gather around the mausoleum, and in the distance, just beyond his view, he swore he saw something watching him. Not a figure, not a shape, but a presence. A dark, formless thing, just beyond the edge of his vision, always moving just out of sight. He turned his head quickly, but there was nothing there. No figure, no movement. But the sensation, the feeling that something was there, was undeniable. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, and his palms began to sweat. As the whispers continued, the growl grew louder. And then, through the corner of his eye, Jack saw it. A movement. The mausoleum door was opening slowly, creaking on rusted hinges. A low, almost mocking sound. He couldn't make himself move. He was too afraid. Every muscle in his body was frozen, as if the whispers were somehow controlling him, pulling him closer to the very thing he feared most. Then the door opened fully, and something stepped out. Jack's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he stood at the edge of the cemetery, his legs trembling and his heart pounding with a force he couldn't control. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to turn and flee, to escape this suffocating, oppressive place, but his feet felt cemented to the earth beneath him. The growl, that awful guttural sound that had emerged from the mausoleum, still echoed in the air, bouncing off the gravestones, filling the space around him like a physical presence. It wasn't just a sound. It was a wave of raw, animalistic power, something ancient and dark. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on him from every side, suffocating him, making every breath harder to draw. His chest constricted as though invisible hands were squeezing him from all directions, tightening with every second that passed. But it wasn't just the growl that had him paralyzed. No, it was what came after. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably close. Jack's eyes darted wildly, searching the night for any sign of movement, any figure emerging from the mausoleum. But the cemetery remained disturbingly still. The shadows seemed to curl at the edges of his vision, flickering and shifting, as though something invisible was moving just beyond the threshold of his awareness. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the graveyard, its light too bright in the stillness, turning the tombstones into monstrous figures, their sharp edges casting long, jagged shadows. The night itself felt alive, as if the very air around him was charged with malevolent energy. Jack could feel it deep in his bones, a kind of dark, heavy presence that seemed to weigh down on him. The footsteps grew louder, closer, each one echoing in the silence with an unnatural cadence. Jack's skin crawled, every nerve in his body screaming for him to turn and run, but the whispers were still there, clinging to the edges of his mind. "Come closer," they beckoned, the voices becoming more insistent, more demanding, like a siren song, pulling him into the depths of the unknown. "We're waiting," the whispers said, and Jack could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He couldn't move, couldn't make himself turn away. It was as if his body had betrayed him, trapped in a state of paralysis as the darkness pressed in around him. The steps grew louder, and now he could hear the faint scrape of something heavy dragging across the ground, a sound that sent chills down his spine. It was then that he saw it, a figure in the distance, barely visible in the shadows near the mausoleum's entrance. At first it was just a shape, a silhouette against the darkness, but it was wrong. So wrong. The figure seemed to distort the shadows around it, bending them unnaturally, warping them in a way that made Jack's stomach turn. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its movements jerky and inhuman, as if it were not quite bound by the same rules of reality that governed the world around him. Its body seemed to shimmer in the darkness, shifting in and out of focus like a mirage. Jack's pulse quickened as he tried to make out its features, but the closer it got, the more it twisted, becoming something even more terrifying, something that defied explanation. The shadows seemed to stretch toward it, drawn to it like magnets, curling and twisting around its form. Jack could hear the faintest whispers now, not just in his ears, but in his mind, as though the words were being spoken directly into his thoughts. They were no longer pleading or begging. Now they were cold, commanding, full of malice. "Come closer," the voices hissed, and Jack's body involuntarily took a step forward, as if he were being controlled by something outside of himself. His feet moved of their own accord, dragging him toward the figure, toward the thing that should not be. He tried to fight it, to resist the pull, but it was like fighting against a tide. Impossible. His heart hammered in his chest, and his hands were slick with sweat as he stumbled forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. It was as if the very earth beneath him had come alive, pulling him toward the center of the cemetery, toward the mausoleum where the darkness was thickest. The figure grew clearer as he got closer, though it still remained a twisted blur in his vision. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs elongated in ways that defied the human form. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it seemed to shimmer, like it was made of smoke or mist. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, as if it were examining Jack, studying him like an insect caught in a web. The eyes, though, were the most terrifying part. They were black. No pupils, no whites, just endless soulless voids that seemed to absorb the light around them. Jack could feel them on him, pulling at his very soul, stripping him bare of any pretense of safety or control. He couldn't look away, couldn't break free from the grip of those eyes. As he took another step forward, he heard the scraping sound again, louder now, as though something sharp was dragging across the ground behind him. He froze, the blood draining from his face. He didn't need to turn around to know that whatever was following him had grown closer. He could feel it, its presence hanging behind him like a dark cloud. And then he heard it, a voice low and guttural coming from behind him. "Not yet," it whispered. "You're not ready." The voice was ancient, like the earth itself was speaking, and Jack's mind spun with confusion and fear. He had no idea where the voice was coming from, only that it was there, lingering in the air around him. His eyes darted back to the figure in front of him, and for the first time he saw it move. The movement was jerky, unnatural, like something struggling to break free from its own skin. It stepped forward, its limbs twitching as though it were trying to take shape, trying to become something real, something solid. And then, with a horrible screech that reverberated in Jack's skull, it lunged at him. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged black teeth. And Jack felt a cold, clammy hand grasp at his arm, pulling him forward. He gasped, his mind screaming in panic, but his body betrayed him, locking him in place, unable to break free from the thing that had claimed him. As the thing pulled him closer, its breath foul and rotten against his skin, Jack caught a glimpse of something in the shadows behind the figure. Something worse, something ancient. A massive skeletal form loomed in the distance, its eyes glowing with a pale, unnatural light. The thing's presence was suffocating, as though the very air around it had been tainted, made unbreathable. Jack could feel its gaze on him, even though he couldn't see its face. It was watching, waiting. Jack stumbled backwards, his feet heavy as lead, as his mind fought to process the nightmare unraveling before his eyes. The pale figure, the one that should not exist, loomed closer, its twisted form stretching and warping with every twitch, every unnatural jerk of its limbs. The air around him thickened with an overwhelming sense of dread, a weight he could feel pressing down on his chest, on his very soul. His breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to breathe, the suffocating weight of the cemetery itself closing in. The whispers that had once seemed like a distant echo now rushed to fill his ears, growing louder, more demanding, almost as if the voices were coming from inside his own skull. He couldn't escape them. They were everywhere. "Join us," they murmured in unison, the voices winding around his mind like snakes, each word wrapping tighter and tighter, squeezing the life from him. His vision swam, the shadows around him distorting, contorting in ways that defied logic, as though the very fabric of reality was warping under the weight of what was happening. His feet shuffled, but he couldn't feel the ground beneath him. It was as though the earth had become an endless, swirling void, and Jack was slipping further into it with every step. His head spun, and he stumbled, his body hitting the cold, rough stone of one of the old gravestones. The impact sent a shock of pain through his spine, but the physical sensation did nothing to ground him. Instead, it only intensified the feeling that the world around him had already fallen apart. His mind raced, the terror flooding his veins like ice. But there was something deeper now, a horrible understanding beginning to grow inside him. It's already too late. The words seemed to echo in his mind, each one a hammer strike against the fragile remnants of his sanity. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to have come to this place, to this cursed cemetery. Jack had known that from the start. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him had known. The warnings had been there. The strange pull, the sense of being watched, the whispers in the wind that had seemed like nothing more than the tricks of an overactive imagination. But it wasn't just that. No, the deeper truth was far worse, and Jack was only beginning to understand it now. The cemetery had never been just a burial ground. It had always been a trap, a place to lure those unfortunate enough to venture too close, a prison for souls that had long since been forgotten. He could feel it now, the oppressive weight of the cemetery, like it had its fingers wrapped around his throat, choking the life out of him. Every breath seemed harder to take, the air thick with the stench of decay and rot, as if the very soil was soaked with death. And the figure, no, it was no longer just a figure. It was something far more ancient, far more terrifying. It wasn't merely standing there, it was feeding. Jack could feel it, deep in his bones. The thing was drawing power from him, from the very essence of his fear. It was growing stronger, more substantial, as though it had been starved for too long, and now, finally, it was feeding on the terror that he could no longer control. The whispers turned into a low hum, like the sound of 1,000 voices murmuring in harmony, as if they were one, together. And Jack realized, with a sickening clarity, that he had been brought here not just to witness the horror, but to become part of it. The shadows stretched in every direction, pulling him toward them. He could feel the earth beneath him tremble, a subtle vibration that set his teeth on edge. The mausoleum, now looming like a massive black monolith against the skyline, seemed to pulse with a terrible energy. The once familiar scent of damp earth had morphed into something far worse, a pungent, sickening stench that burned his nostrils and made his stomach churn. It was the smell of something ancient, of rot so deep it reached into the very marrow of the bones buried beneath his feet. Jack could feel his knees weakening, his legs beginning to give way, but his body refused to cooperate. It was as if his muscles had turned to jelly, refusing to support him, leaving him to fall further into the oppressive grip of the cemetery's malevolent force. In a desperate bid for clarity, Jack tried to focus, tried to make sense of what was happening. His mind raced back to the words of the old man, the one who had warned him. "The past never stays buried," the man had said, his voice trembling as if he too had felt the weight of what lurked beneath the ground. At the time, Jack had dismissed it as superstition, but now he understood. The past wasn't something that had simply been left behind. No, it was something that stayed, lingering in the soil, in the very air itself, waiting, watching, feeding. The cemetery was not just a resting place, it was a prison, a holding ground for the forgotten dead, those who had once lived and breathed, who had been buried not in peace, but in wrath. Their hatred and bitterness had festered in the grave, twisting and corrupting until they became something else entirely. Something dark, something hungry. The figure moved again, its jerky movements like the twitch of a dying animal, and Jack's heart raced. It was almost upon him now, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The creature's black eyes seemed to pierce into him, dragging his very soul from his body, pulling him into the depths of its void. He could feel its coldness now, like an icy wind cutting through him, draining his warmth, his energy, his will to fight. He wasn't alone. No, Jack wasn't alone at all. He could hear them now, whispers, footsteps, the shuffle of something ancient moving in the shadows. It was as if the entire cemetery had come to life, its very stones groaning, its earth heaving, ready to consume him. Then he heard it. the deep rumble that shook the air around him, a low guttural growl that came from deep within the mausoleum itself. It wasn't the creature. No, this was something else, something far worse. The growl echoed like thunder, rattling the air with a force that rattled his bones. The ground seemed to split open beneath his feet, and Jack felt himself falling, plunging downward into the darkness that had been waiting for him all along. The growl grew louder, a deafening roar that filled his ears, drowning out everything else. It was a sound so raw, so filled with hatred, that Jack's mind couldn't comprehend it. And then, silence. The world stopped. The whispers, the growls, the footsteps, everything. Dead silence. Jack stood on the edge of that silence, his breath held in his chest, waiting for the next sound to break the void. But there was nothing. Nothing but the feeling of cold, empty eyes watching him from the depths of the grave, and the oppressive weight of a past that would never, ever let him leave. The air had thickened, pressing down on Jack's chest like an unbearable weight. His breathing became shallow, erratic, as his heart pounded in his ears. Every corner of the cemetery seemed to twist around him, the shadows stretching longer with each passing second, making the air feel tighter, more oppressive. He wanted to run, to escape the suffocating presence that had trapped him here, but his legs betrayed him, locked in place by an invisible force. His feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the very earth was reaching up, pulling him deeper into its unholy grip. It was the feeling of being trapped, utterly powerless, like a mouse caught in the jaws of a snake. And there, standing before him, that twisted figure continued its slow, deliberate approach, its eyes burning with an intensity that sliced through him like a blade. The whispers were louder now, no longer just whispers, but an overwhelming chorus of voices that seemed to pour from the soil itself. It was as though the dead weren't just in the ground. They were part of the ground, part of the very foundation of the cemetery, feeding on the fear, the pain, the despair of anyone who dared to step onto their cursed land. Each voice was distinct, a hollow, tortured wail echoing in Jack's mind, as if the spirits were clamoring for release, desperate to share their stories with the living, even if it meant driving them to madness. Jack could hear their cries now, sharp and guttural, growing louder with every step the creature took toward him. He was no longer sure where the whispers ended and his thoughts began. They bled together, a haunting symphony that tore at his sanity, urging him to understand, to listen to their pleas. But he knew deep down that listening would only bring him closer to the truth, and that truth, whatever it was far worse than anything he could imagine. The ground beneath him felt alive, almost as if it were breathing. The graves, the tombstones, each one seemed to pulse as though something beneath the earth was stirring, waking from a long, dark slumber. The trees, gnarled and twisted, appeared to be reaching out toward him with their skeletal branches, their bark thick with age, like ancient fingers stretching to drag him down into the earth. He could hear the faint rustling of leaves, but it wasn't the wind that made them move. No, this was something else, a presence, a dark force that rippled through the cemetery like a tangible entity. Jack's mind raced, trying to grasp at some semblance of control, but the more he fought, the deeper he sank into the terror. The more he tried to escape, the more the cemetery closed in on him, its power suffocating, its grip tightening with every passing moment. His eyes darted from one shadow to the next, every corner of the cemetery now filled with crawling, lurking shapes. For a moment he swore he saw faces, horrible, contorted faces, emerging from the dark, their eyes hollow, their mouths stretched into grotesque, silent screams. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend and warp around him. He was no longer sure whether he was still standing in the cemetery or if he had crossed into some other plane of existence. The world around him had dissolved into a nightmare where nothing made sense, and yet everything felt terrifyingly real. The air was thick with the stench of rot, decay, and something far worse, the unmistakable odor of death, as if the earth itself had become a tomb for the souls of the restless dead. He could almost taste it on his tongue, the foulness creeping into his lungs with each breath he took. In a panic-fueled attempt to escape, Jack tried to take a step backward, but his body refused to cooperate. It felt as though his feet were glued to the ground, his movement sluggish, hindered by an unseen force that held him in place. The weight of the past, the souls of the forgotten, the wronged, the tortured, pressed against him, suffocating him with its unbearable intensity. Each step backward felt like wading through thick, cold mud, the earth pulling him in, pulling him deeper into its depths. The figure, if it could still be called that, was upon him now, its face twisted in an expression of pure malice. The eyes, dark and empty, bore into him, and Jack could feel them probing the very core of his being, seeking out his darkest fears, his deepest regrets, and feeding off them like a parasite. The creature's lips parted in a silent, mocking grin, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw something flicker, something dark and terrible, a shadow behind its empty eyes, a memory. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of the fleeting image, but it was gone in an instant, leaving only the creeping dread that clawed at the edges of his sanity. And then, the whispers, the voices of the dead, grew louder, more insistent. Jack's head throbbed with the pressure of their combined wails, their desperate cries for release. He couldn't take it anymore. He was losing himself, losing grip on reality, and the cemetery knew it. It was consuming him. With each breath, with each tortured step, it was devouring his very soul, stripping him of his humanity, of everything that made him Jack. The ground trembled once more, this time with greater force. A low, rumbling sound echoed from beneath the earth, a vibration that shook his bones, rattling him to the core. The earth cracked open in front of him, and out of the darkness emerged something far worse than the creature itself. It was as though the very cemetery was alive, its rotting roots clawing through the soil, pulling forth long-dead bodies from their graves. These bodies, decomposed, their skin stretched tight over brittle bones, rose from the earth, their eyes empty, their mouths agape in eternal silent screams. They were not dead. Not truly. They had been changed, twisted by the malevolent force that had taken root in this cursed ground. Their bodies moved with unnatural precision, jerking and twitching as if guided by some unseen hand. An army of the undead, rising to claim what had been promised to them. Jack's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. His body screamed in protest, but there was no escape. No place to hide. The cemetery had won. He could feel it in every fiber of his being, the cold, unrelenting force that had claimed him, body and soul. As the first of the risen dead drew near, Jack's vision blurred. His thoughts became a haze of panic and terror. He wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but there was no one to hear. And then, in that moment of total despair, when he thought he would be swallowed by the darkness forever, a final voice broke through the chorus of whispers, a voice that was not of the living but something far worse, a voice that carried the weight of centuries, a voice that had witnessed the suffering of countless souls trapped in this cursed place. You are ours now. If you think you've seen the worst, subscribe and hit the bell for more. What if the dead never really left? What if they're still waiting, calling to you from the shadows?